Chapter 6 of Undue Caesar. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording done by Jules Harlock of Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. Unto Caesar by Baroness Orczy. Chapter 6. I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. Revelations 22, verse 13. And after that silence and peace. Silence save for the moaning of the child, Nola, who in a passionate outburst of grief had thrown herself on the body of her mother. Dea Flavia stood there still and calm, her young face scarce less white than the clinging folds of her tunic, her unfathomable eyes fixed upon the pathetic group at her feet. The weeping girl and the dead woman. She seemed almost dazed, like one who does not understand, and a quaint puzzled frown appeared upon the whiteness of her brow. Once she raised her eyes to the praefect and encountered his gaze, strangely contemptuous and wrathful, fixed upon her own, and anon she shuddered when a pitiful moan from Nola echoed from end to end along the marbled walls around, and the crowd of idlers began slowly to disperse. In groups of twos and threes they went, their sandalled feet making a soft rustling noise against the flagstones of the forum, and their cloaks of thin woollen stuff floating out behind them as they walked. The young patricians were the first to go. The scene had ceased to be amusing, and Dea Flavia was not like to bestow another smile. They thought it best to retire to their luxurious homes, for they vaguely resented the majesty of death which clung round the dead freedwoman and the young living slave. They hoped to forget in the course of the noonday sleep and the subsequent delights of the table the painful events which had so unpleasantly stirred their shallow hearts. Dea Flavia paid no heed to them as they murmured words of leave-taking in her ear. 'Tis doubtful if she saw one of them or cared if they went or stayed. At an order from the praefect, the auction sale was abruptly suspended. The lectors drove the herds of human cattle together, preparatory to taking them to their quarters on the slopes of the Aventine, where they would remain until the morrow, whilst the scribes and auctioneers made haste to scramble down from the heights of the rostrum, the heat of the day having rendered that elevated position well nigh unbearable. Only Dea Flavia's retinue lingered in the forum. Standing at a respectful distance, they surrounded the gorgeously draped litter, waiting, silently and timorous, the further pleasure of their mistress, and behind Dea Flavia her two Ethiopian slaves, stolidly holding the palm leaves to shield her head against the blazing sun, which so mercilessly seared their own naked shoulders. "Grant me leave to escort thee to thy litter, Augusta," murmured a timid voice. It was young Hortensius Martius who spoke. He had approached the castata, and now stood timid and a suppliant beside Dea Flavia, with his curly head bare to the scorching sun and his back bent in slave-like deference. But the young girl seemed not to hear him, and even after he had twice repeated his request, she turned to him with uncomprehending eyes. "I would not leave thee, Dea," he said, "until I saw thee safely among thy slaves and thy clients." Then at last did she speak, but her voice sounded toneless and dull, as of one who speaks in a dream. "I thank thee, good Hortensius," she said, "but my slaves are close at hand, and I would prefer to be left alone." To insist further would have been churlish. Hortensius Martius well versed in every phase of decorum, bowed his head in obedience and retired to his litter. But he told his slaves not to bear him away from the Forum altogether, but to place the litter down under the arcades of the tabernae, and then to stand round it so that it could not be seen, whilst he himself could still keep watch over the movements of Dea Flavia. But she in the meanwhile remained in the same inert position, standing listlessly beside the body of Menecreta, her face expressing puzzlement rather than horror, as if within her soul she was trying to reconcile the events of the last few moments with her previous conceptions of what the tenor of her life should be. The curse of Menecreta had found sudden and awful fulfilment, and Dea Flavia remained vaguely wondering whether the gods had been asleep on this hot late summer's day, and forgotten to shield their favourite daughter against the buffetings of fate. A freed woman had roused superstitious fear in the heart of a daughter of the Caesars. Surely there must be something very wrong in the administrations of the affairs of this world. Nay, more, for the freed woman, unconscious of her own impiety, had triumphed in the end. Her death, majestic and sublime in its suddenness, had set the seal upon her malediction. And Dea Flavia marvelled that the dead woman remained so calm, her eyes so still, when, if indeed Jupiter had been aroused by the monstrous sacrilege, she must now be facing the terrors of his judgments. And Taurus Antinor watched her in silence while she stood thus, unconscious of his gaze, a perfect picture of exquisite womanhood set in a frame of marble temples and colonnades, a dome of turquoise above her head, the palm leaves above her throwing a dense blue shadow on her golden hair and the white tunic on her shoulders. He had heard much of Dea Flavia, the daughter of Claudius Octavius, and now the ward of the Emperor Caligula, since his return from Syria a year ago, and he had oft seen her gilded and rose-draped litter gliding along the Sacra Via or the Via Appia, surrounded with its numberless retinue, but he had never seen her so close as this, nor had he heard her speak. She was a mere child and still under the tutelage of her despotic father, when he, Taurus Antinor, tired of the enervating influences of decadent Rome, had obtained leave from the Emperor Tiberius to go to Syria as its governor. The imperator was glad enough to let him go. Taurus Antinor, named Anglicanus, was more popular with the army and the plebs than any autocratic ruler could wish. He went to Syria and remained there half a dozen years. The jealousy of one emperor had sent him thither, and 'twas the jealousy of another that called him back to Rome. Syria had liked its governor over well, and Cassius Julius Caesar Caligula would not brook rivalry in the allegiance owed to himself alone by his subjects, even by those who dwelt in the remotest provinces of the empire. But on his return to Rome the powerful personality of Taurus Antinor soon imposed itself upon the fierce and maniacal despot Caligula, though he must in reality have hated the Anglicanus as much and more than he hated all men. He gave grudging admiration to his independence of spirit and to his fearless tongue. In the midst of an entourage composed of lying sycophants and of treacherous minions, the Caesar seemed to feel in the presence of the stranger a sense of security and of trust. Some writers have averred that Caligula looked on Taurus Antinor as a kind of personal fetish who kept the wrath of the gods averted from his imperial head. Be that as it may, there is no doubt that tyrant exerted his utmost power to keep Taurus near his person, showering upon him those honours and titles of which he would have been equally ready to deprive him had the stranger at any time ran counter to his will. Anon, when the Caesar thought it incumbent upon his dignity to start on a military expedition, he forced Antenor to accept the praefecture of the city in order to keep him permanently settled in Rome. The Anglicanus accepted the power, which was almost supreme in the absence of the Caesar. He even gave the oath demanded of him by the Emperor that he would remain at his post until the termination of the proposed military expedition. But it was easy to see that the dignities for which others would have fought and striven to the uttermost were not really to the liking of Taurus Antenor. Avowedly wilful of temper, he had since his return from Syria became even more silent, more self-centred than before. Many called him morose and voted him either treacherous or secretly ambitious. Others averred that he was either very arrogant or frankly dull. Certain it is that he held himself very much aloof from the society of his kind, and persistently refused to mix with the young elegants of the day, either in their circles or their baths, their private parties or public entertainments. Thus it was that the praefect found himself to-day for the first time in the near presence of Dea Flavia, the acknowledged queen of that same society which he declined to frequent, and as he grudgingly admitted to himself that she was beautiful beyond what men had said of her, he remembered all the tales which he had heard of her callous pride, her cold dignity, and of that cruel disdain with which she rejected all homage and broke the hearts of those whom her beauty had brought to her feet. For the moment, however, she struck him as more pathetic than fearsome. She looked lonely just now, like a stately lily blooming alone in a deserted garden. He was wroth with her for what she had done to Menecreta, and for her childish caprice and opposition to his will. But at the same time he who had so seldom felt pity for those whom a just punishment had overtaken, was sorry for this young girl, for in her case retribution had been severe and out of all proportion to her fault. Therefore he approached her almost with deference and forced his rough voice to gentleness, as he said to her: "The hour is late, O Dea Flavia. I myself must leave the forum now. I would wish to see thee safe amongst thy women." She turned her blue eyes upon him. His voice had roused her from her meditations, and recalled to her that sense of proud dignity with which she loved to surround herself as with an invisible walls. She must have seen the pity in his eyes, for he did not try to hide it, but it seemed to anger her as coming from this man who, to her mind, was the primary cause of her present trouble. She looked for a moment or two on him as if trying to recollect his very existence, and no importunate slave would ever encounter such complete disdain as felt on the praefect at this moment from Dea Flavia's glance. "I will return to my palace at the hour which pleases me most, O praefectus," she said coldly, "and when the child Nola, being more composed, is ready to accompany me." "Nay," he rejoined in his accustomed rough way, "the slave Nola is not to thee now. She will be looked after as the state directs." "The slave is mine," she retorted curtly. "She shall come with me." And even as she spoke she drew herself up to her full height, more like, he thought, than ever to a stately lily now. The crown of gold upon her head caught a glint from the noonday sun, and the folds of her white tunic fell straight and rigid from her shoulders down to her feet. It seemed strange to him that one so young, so exquisitely pure, should thus be left all alone to face the hard moments of life. Her very disdain for him, her wilfulness, seemed to him pathetic, for they showed her simple ignorance of the many cruelties which life must of necessity have in store for her. As for yielding to her present mood, he had no thought of it. It was caprice originally, which had caused her to defy his will and to break old Menecreta's heart. She had invoked strict adherence to the law for the sole purpose of indulging this caprice. Now he was tempted also to stand upon the law and to defy her tyrannical will, even at the cost of his own inclination in the matter. He would not trust her with the child Nola now. He had other plans for the orphan girl, rendered lonely and desolate through a great lady's whim, and he would have felt degradation in the thought that Dea Flavia should impose her will on him in this. He knew her power, of course. She was a near kinswoman of the Emperor, and the child of his adoption. She was all powerful with the Cæsar, as with all men through the might of his personality as much as through that of her wealth. But he had no thought of yielding nor any thought of fear. It seemed as if in the heat-laden atmosphere two mighty wills had suddenly clashed one against the other, brandishing ghostly steels. His will against hers, the might of manhood and of strength against the word of a beautiful woman. Nor was the contest unequal. If he could crush her with a touch of his hand, she could destroy him with one word in the Cæsar's ear. She had as her ally the full unbridled might of the house of Cæsar, while against her there was only this stranger, a descendant of a freedwoman from a strange land. For the nonce his influence was great over the mind of the quasi-madman who sat on the Emperor's throne, but any moment, any event, the whisper of an enemy, the word of a woman, might put an end to his power. All this Dea Flavia knew, and knowing it found pleasure in toying with his wrath. Armed with the triple weapon of her beauty, her purity, and her power, she taunted him with his impotence, and smiled with scornful pity upon his weakness of his manhood. Even now she turned to Nola and said with gentle firmness, "Get up, girl, and come with me." But at her words the last vestige of deference fled from the praefect's manner. Pity now would have been weak folly. Had he yielded he would have despised himself even as this proud girl now affected to scorn him. He interposed his massive figure between Dea Flavia and the slave, and said loudly, "By thy leave, Nola, the daughter of Menecreta is the property of the state, and 'tis I will decide whither she goeth now." "Until tomorrow only, Taurus Antinor," she rejoined coldly, "for tomorrow she must be in the slave market again, when my agents will bid for and buy her according to my will. Nay, she shall not be put up for sale tomorrow." "By whose authority, O praefectus?" "By mine. The state hath given me leave to purchase privately a number of slaves from the late censor's household. 'Tis my intention to purchase Nola thus." "Thou hast no right," she said, still speaking with outward calm, though her whole soul rebelled against the arrogance of this man who dared to thwart her will, to gainsay her word, and set up his dictates against hers. "Thou hast no right thus to take the law in thine own hands." "Nay, as to that," he replied with equal calm, "I'll answer for mine own actions, but the slave Nola shall not pass into thy hands, Augusta. Thou hast wrought quite enough mischief as it is. Be content and go thy way. Leave the child in peace." In these days of unbridled passions and unfettered tyranny, a man who spoke thus to the daughter of the Cæsars spoke at the peril of his life. Both Dea Flavia and Taurus Antinor knew this when they faced one another eye to eye, their very souls in rebellion one against the other, his own turbulent and fierce, with the hot blood from a remote land coursing in his veins, blinding him to his own advantage, to his own future, to everything save to his feeling of independence at all costs from the oppression of this family of tyrants, her own almost serene in its consciousness of limitless power. For the moment her sense of dignity prevailed. Whatever she might do in the future, she was comparatively helpless now. The praefect in the discharge of his functions, second only to the Caesar, was all powerful where he stood. Taurus Antinor was still the praefect of Rome, still a member of the Senate and the favourite of Caligula. He had her at a disadvantage now, just as she had held him a while ago when she forced on the public sale of the girl Nola. Therefore, though with a look she would have crushed the insolent, and her delicate hands were clenched into fists that would have chastised him then and there if they had the strength, she returned his look of fierce defiance with her usual one of calm. "Thou hast spoken, Taurus Antinor," she said coldly, "and in deference to the law which thou dost represent, I bow to thy commands. Art thou content?" she added, seeing that he made no reply. "Content?" he asked, puzzled at her meaning. "Aye," she said, "I asked thee if thou wert content. Thou hast humiliated a daughter of Cæsar, a humiliation which she is not like to forget. I crave my pardon if I have transgressed beyond the limits of my duty." "Thy duty? Nay, Taurus Antinor, a man's duties are as varied as a woman's moods, and he is wisest who knows how to adapt the one to the other. 'Tis not good, remember, to run counter to Dea Flavia's will. 'Tis much that thou must have forgotten, O praefect, ere thou didst set thy so-called duty above the fulfilment of my wish." "Nay, gracious lady," he said simply, "I had forgotten nothing, not even that Archelaus Menes the sculptor died for having angered thee, nor that Julius Campanius perished in exile and young Decretas in fetters because of thy enmity. Thou seest that, though somewhat of a stranger in Rome, I know much of its secret history, and though mine eyes had until now never beheld thy loveliness, yet had mine ears heard much of thy power. Yet at its first encounter thou didst defy it. I have no mother to mourn over my death like young Decretas," he said curtly, "nor yet a wife to make into a sorrowing widow like the sculptor Menes. If it was his desire to break through the barrier of well-nigh insolent calm which she seemed to have set round her dainty person, then he succeeded over well, for she winced at his words like one who had received a blow, and her eyes, dark with anger, narrowed until they became mere slits fringed by her golden lashes. "But thou hast a life, Taurus Antinor," she said, "and life is a precious possession." He shrugged his massive shoulders, and a curious smile played round his lips. "And thou canst order that precious possession to be taken from me," he said lightly. "Is that what thou wouldst say?" "That and more, for thou hast other precious treasures more precious, mayhap, than life, so guard them well, O Taurus Antinor." "Nay, gracious lady," he rejoined, still smiling, "I have but one soul as I have one life, and that too is in the hands of God." "Of which God?" she asked quaintly. He did not reply, but pointed upward at the vivid dome of blue against which the white Phrygian marbles glittered in the sun. "Of him whose empire is mightier than that of Rome." She looked on him in astonishment. Apparently she did not understand him, nor did he try to explain. But it seemed to her as if her whole appearance had changed suddenly, and her thoughts flew back to that which she had witnessed a year ago when she was in Ostia, and she had seen a raging tempest become suddenly stilled. "There is no mightier empire than that of Rome," she said proudly, "and methinks thou art a traitor, O Taurus Antinor, else thou wouldst not speak of any emperor save of Caesar, my kinsman." "I spoke not of an emperor, gracious lady," he said simply, "but thy thoughts were of one whose empire was mightier than that of Rome." "My thoughts," he said, "were of a man whom I saw whilst travelling through Judæa a few years ago. He was poor and dwelt among the fishermen of Galilee. They stood round him and listened whilst he talked. When he walked they followed him, for a halo of glory was upon him, and the words which he spoke were such that once heard they could never be forgotten." "Didst thou too hear those marvellous words, O Taurus Antinor?" she asked. "Only twice," he replied, "did I hear the words which he spoke. I mingled with the crowd, and once when his eyes fell upon me, it seemed to me as if all the secrets of life and death were suddenly revealed to me. His eyes fell upon me. I was one of a multitude. But from that moment I knew that life on this earth would never be precious to me again, since the most precious gift man hath is his immortality." "Thou speakest of strange matters, O praefect," she rejoined, "and meseems there is treason in what thou sayest. Who is this man whose very look hath made a slave of thee?" "A slave to his will thou sayest truly, O daughter of Cæsar. Could I hear his command I would follow him through life and to death. At times even now meseems that I can hear his voice and see his eyes." "Thou hast never seen such eyes, Augusta, fixed upon my very soul." "I saw them just now, right across the Forum, when the wretched freedwoman clung shrieking round my shins. They looked at me and asked me to be merciful. They did not command, they begged, asking for the pity that lay dormant in my soul. And now I know that if those same eyes looked at me again and asked for every drop of my blood, if they asked me to bear death, torture or even shame, I would become as thou truly sayest, a slave." Once or twice while he spoke she had tried to interrupt him, but every time the words she would have spoken had died upon her lips. He looked so strange, this praefect of Rome, whose judgments every one feared, whose strict adherence to the duty of young elegants of the day were ever fond of deriding. He looked very strange now and spoke such strange words, words that she resented bitterly, for they sounded like treason to the house of Cæsar of which she was so coldly proud. To her Cæsar was a god, and she as his kinswoman had been brought up to worship in him, not the man, that might be vile, but the supreme power in the empire which he represented. She did not pause to think if he were base, tyrannical, a half crazy despot without a mind or heart or sensibilities. She knew what she said about him, she had even seen at times things from which she recoiled in unspeakable horror. But her soul, still pure and still proud, was able to disassociate the abstract idea of the holy and the mighty Cæsar from its present hideous embodiment, and this same holy reverence for Cæsar she looked for in all those who she deemed were worthy to stand, not as his equals, for only the gods were that, but nigh to his holy person, his own kinsmen first, then his senate, his magistrates and his patricians, and above all this man, almost a stranger, whom the Cæsar had deigned to honour with his confidence. And yet this same stranger spoke calmly of another, of a man whom he would obey as a slave in all things, whom he would follow even to death, a man whose might he proclaimed above that of Caesar himself. "But who is this man?" she exclaimed, at last almost involuntarily. "A poor man from Galilee," he replied. "What is he called?" "Out there they call him Jesus of Nazareth." "And where is he now?" "He died upon the cross in Jerusalem 7 years ago." "Upon the cross!" she exclaimed. "What had he done?" "He had dwelt among the poor and brought them contentment and peace. He had lived amongst men and taught them love and charity. So the Roman proconsul ordered him to be crucified, and those whom he had rendered happy rejoiced over his death. Methinks I did hear something of this. I was a child then, but already I took much interest in the affairs of state, and my father spoke oft freely in my presence. I remember his talking of a demagogue over in Judæa who claimed to be the King of the Jews, and who was punished for treason and sedition. But I also heard that he did but little mischief, since only a troop of ignorant fisher folk followed and listened to him. "Ignorant fisher folk, thou saidst it truly, O Dea Flavia. Yet I have it in my mind that anon the knee of every patrician, I, of every Cæsar, shall bend before the mighty throne of that man from Galilee." "And thus didst learn thy lesson of treason, O praefect," she retorted. "Demagogues and traitors from Judæa have sown the seeds of treachery in thy mind, and whilst thou dost receive with both hands the gifts of Cæsar my kinsman, thou dost set up another above him, and dost homage to him in thy heart." "Aye, in my heart, gracious lady, for I am even more ignorant than those fishermen from Galilee who heard every word spoken by Jesus of Nazareth. I heard him but twice in my life, and once only did his eyes rest upon me, and they enchained my heart to his service, though I know but little yet of what he would have me do. No doubt he would have thee turn traitor to thine emperor, and to acclaim him, the demagogue, as imperator before the Senate and the army. He—" "I told thee that he was dead," he interposed simply, "and that his words had made thee rebellious to Cæsar and insolent to me." "Thine humble servant, O Augusta," he rejoined, smiling in spite of himself, for now she was just like an angry child. "Wilt but command and see how I will obey." "The girl, Nola," she said haughtily. "In that alone I must deny thee." "Then tie my shoe, it hath come undone." The tone with which she had said this was so arrogant and so harsh that even her slaves behind her turned frightened eyes on the praefect, who was known to be so proud, and on whom the curt command must have had the effect of a sudden whiplash on the face. She had spoken as if the humblest of her menials, finding pleasure in putting this insult on the man who had dared to thwart and irritate her. But she had not spoken deliberately, it had been an impulse, an irresistible desire to see him down on his knees, in the position only fit for slaves. Directly the words had left her mouth she already regretted them, for his refusal now would have been doubly humiliating for herself, and her good sense had told her already that no patrician, least of all Taurus Antinor, would submit quietly to public insult and ridicule even from her. The quick, more gentle word was already on her lips, the look of mute apology was struggling to her eyes, when to her astonishment the praefect, without a word, was down on his knees before her. "Nay," she said, "I did but jest." "The honour," he said quietly, "is too great, O daughter of Cæsar, that I should forego it now." His powerful shoulders were bent almost to the level of the ground, and she looked down on him, more puzzled than ever at this stranger whose every action seemed different from those of his fellow men. She put her little foot slightly forward, and as he tied the string of her shoe she saw how slender was his hand, firm yet tapering down slightly to the elegant finger tips, the hand of a patrician even though he hailed from the barbaric north. Suddenly she smiled, but this he did not see, for he was still intent upon the shoe. But she felt that those slender hands of his were singularly clumsy, and she smiled because she had recollected how like his fellow men he really was, how he evidently forgot his wrath and sank his pride for the pleasure of kneeling at her feet. To this homage she was well accustomed. Many there were in Rome who at this moment would gladly have changed places with the praefect. More than one great patrician had craved the honour of tying her shoe. More than one patrician hand had trembled whilst performing this service, and Dea Flavia smiled because already she guessed, or thought she had guessed, what would follow the tying of her shoe. A humble kiss upon her foot, the natural homage of a man to her beauty and to her power. The daughter of Caesar smiled because the spirit of childlike waywardness was in her, and she thought that she would like this slave-like homage from this man whom her wrath and threats had left impassive, but whom her beauty had at last brought down to his knees. And thus smiling she waited patiently, content that he should be clumsy, glad that in a distance, under the arcade of the tabernae, she had spied Hortensius Martius, watching with wrathful eyes every movement of the praefect. She wondered if the young exquisite had heard the wordy warfare between herself and the proud man who now knelt quite awkwardly at her feet. And she guessed that what Hortensius had seen and heard, that he would retail at full length to his friends in the course of the banquet given by Cassius Nepos tomorrow night. For the moment she felt almost sorry for the giant brought down to his knees. The kiss which she so confidently anticipated would of truth completed his surrender, since she had resolved to make him kiss the dust by suddenly withdrawing her foot from under his lips, and then to laugh at him, and to allow her slaves to laugh and jeer at him as he lay sprawling in the dust, his huge arms lying crosswise on the flagstones before her. The spirit of mischief was in her, the love to tease a helpless giant. So for the nonce anger almost died out within her, and her eyes looked clear and blue as triumph and joy danced within their depths. But now Taurus Antinor had finished tying her shoe. He did not stoop further, nor did he embrace the dust, but he straightened his broad shoulders and raised himself from his knees, without rendering that homage which was expected of him. "Hast further commands for thy servant, O daughter of Caesar?" he asked calmly. "None," she replied curtly, and calling her slaves to her, she entered her litter, and drew its curtains closely round her so that she should no longer be offended by his sight. Chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Unto Caesar. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording done by Jules Harlock of Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. Unto Caesar by Baroness Orczy. Chapter 7. The fool hath said in his heart, There is no God. Psalm 14, verse 1. And late that day, when Dea Flavia was preparing for rest, she dismissed her tirewoman, keeping only her young slaves round her, and then ordered Licinia to attend on her this night. Licinia was highly privileged in the house of Dea Flavia. She had nursed the daughter of proud Claudius Octavius at her breast, and between the wizened old woman and the fresh young girl there existed perfect friendship and the confidence born of years. Dea's first tooth was in Licinia's keeping, and so was the first lock of her hair cut from Dea's head. Licinia had been the confidant of Dea's first childish sorrow, and was the first to hear the tales of the young girl's social triumphs. No one but Licinia was allowed to handle Dea's hair. It was her shrivelled fingers that plaited every night the living stream of gold into the innumerable little plaits, so that the ripple in it might continue to live again on the morrow. It was Licinia who rubbed Dea's exquisite limbs with unguents after the bath, and she who trimmed the rose-tinted nails into their perfect pointed shape. To-night Dea Flavia was lying on the couch covered with crimson silk. Her elbows were buried in the cushion stuffed with eiderdown. Her chin rested in her two hands, and her eyes were fixed on the mirror of polished bronze held up by one of her younger slaves. Licinia, stooping over the reclining body of her mistress, was gently rubbing the white shoulders and spine with sweet scented oil. "And didst see it all, Licinia?" asked Dea Flavia, as with a lazy stretch of her graceful arms she suddenly swung herself round on to her back and looked straight up at the wrinkled old face bending tenderly over her. "Ay, my precious," replied Licinia eagerly. "Everything did I see, for thou didst draw the curtains of thy litter together so quickly, I had no time to take my place by thy side. I meant to follow immediately, and was only waiting there for a moment or two, until the crowd of thy retinue had dispersed along the various streets. Then it was that I spied my lord Hortensius, and something in the expression of his face made me pause then and there to see if there was aught amiss." "And was aught amiss with my lord Hortensius?" asked Dea Flavia with studied indifference. "He looked wrathful as a tiger in the arena when the guards come and snatch his prey from him. There was a frown on his face darker than that which usually sits on Taurus Antinor's brow." "He was angered?" "Ay, at the praefect," rejoined Licinia. "He strode forward from under the arcades directly after the crowd of thy slaves had disappeared, and the forum was all deserted save for Taurus Antinor standing there as if he had been carved in marble and in bronze and rooted there to the spot. My lord Hortensius came close up to the praefect and greeted him curtly. I dared no longer move away lest I should be seen, so I hid in the deep shadows behind the rostrum, and I heard Taurus Antinor's response to my lord Hortensius." "Yes, yes," said Dea Flavia impatiently. "Of course they greeted one another ere they came to blows, but 'tis of the blows I would like to hear, and what my lord Hortensius said to the praefect." "He spoke to him of thee, my child, and taunted him with having angered thee," said Licinia. "The praefect is so proud and so impatient. I marvelled then that he did not hit my lord Hortensius in the face at once. He looked so huge. I bethought me of a giant, and his head looked dark like the bronze head of Jupiter, for his face had flushed a deep and angry crimson, whilst his mighty fists were clenched as if ready to strike." "What caused him to strike then?" "My lord Hortensius called him a stranger, and this the praefect did not seem to resent." There are other lands than Rome, he said, and one of these gave my ancestors birth. Proud am I of my distant land, and proud now to be a patrician of Rome." Then did my lord Hortensius break into loud laughter, which to mine ears sounded mirthless and forced. He raised his hand and pointed a finger at the praefect, and shouted, still laughing, "Thou a patrician of Rome? Thou a tyrant's minion, slave and son of a slave? Nay, if the patriciate of Rome had its will with thee, it would have thee publicly whipped and branded like an arrogant menial that thou art." "This and more did my lord Hortensius say," continued Licinia, whose voice now had sunk to an awed whisper at the recollection of the sacrilege. I hardly dared to breathe, for I could see the praefect's face, and could think of naught save the wrath of Jupiter, when on a sultry evening the thunder clouds are gathering in the wake of the setting sun. But Dea Flavia's interest in the narrative seemed suddenly to have flagged. She stretched her arms, yawned ostentatiously, and with the movement of a fretful child she threw herself once more flat upon the couch, with her elbows in the cushions and her face buried in her hands. With some impatience she snatched the mirror from the young slave's hand, and then she put it on the pillow and looked straight down into it, whilst her hair fell like golden curtains down each side of her face. "Go on, Licinia," she said with curt indifference. "There is but little more to tell," said the old woman, who with stolid placidness had resumed her former occupation, and once more rubbed the white shoulders with the sweet smelling unguent. "Nor could I tell thee how it all happened. A sort of tempestuous whirlwind seemed to sweep before my eyes, and the next thing that I saw clearly was the enormous figure clad in a gorgeous tunic, and standing high, high above me on the very top of the marble rostrum beside the bronze figure of the god. It was the praefect. From where I stood, palsied with fear, I could see his face, dark now as the very thunders of Jupiter. His hair around his head gleamed like copper in the sun, but what caused my very blood to freeze and the marrow to stiffen in my bones was to see his two mighty arms high above his head, holding the body of my lord Hortensius. He looked up there like some godlike giant about to hurl an enemy down from the mountains of Olympus. The rostrum stands a terrific height above the pavement of the Forum, the marble balustrades, the outstanding gradients, the carvings along its sides, all stood between that inert body held up aloft by those gigantic arms, and the flagstones below where death, hideous and yawning, seemed to be waiting for its prey. And still the praefect did not move, and I could see the muscles of his arms swollen like cords, and the sinews of his hands almost cracking between the weight of my lord Hortensius's body. Licinia paused and passed a wrinkled hand over her moist forehead. She was trembling even now at the recollection of what she had seen. The beautiful figure lying stretched out upon the couch had not moved in a single one of its graceful lines. The tiny head beneath its crown of gold was bent down upon the mirror. "Couldst see my lord Hortensius's face?" came in the same cold tones of indifference from behind the veil of wavy hair. "No," said Licinia. "I thank the gods that I could not." One cry for mercy did he utter, one cry of horror, when first he felt himself uplifted and looked down into the awful face of death which awaited him below. Then mayhap he lost consciousness, for I heard not a sound, and the whole city lay still in the hush of the noonday sleep. Less than 1 minute had intervened since first I saw that avenging figure outlined against the blue curtain of the sky. Less than 1 minute even whilst my heart had ceased to beat. And then did a cry of horror escape my lips, and the praefect looked down into my face. Nor did he move as yet, but slowly meseems as if the ruddy glow died from out of his cheeks and brow, and after a while the tension on the mighty arms relaxed, and slowly were they lowered from above his head. He no longer was looking at me now, for his eyes were fixed upon the distant sky, as if they saw there something that called with irresistible power, and upon the heat-laden air there trembled a long sigh as of infinite longing. Then the praefect gathered my lord Hortensius's inanimate body in his arms as a mother would her own child, and with slow and steady steps he descended the gradients of the rostrum. At its foot he caught sight of me, and called me to him. My lord hath only fainted, he said to me. Do thou chafe his hands and soothe his forehead, whilst I send his slaves to him. He laid the precious burden down in the cool shadow, taking off his own cloak and making it a pillow for my lord Hortensius's head. Then he went from me, and as he went I could hear him murmur, "In thy service, O man of Galilee." Even as these last words still trembled on Licinia's lips, there came a sharp cry of rage, followed by one of terror, as with quick and almost savage movement Dea Flavia picked up the heavy mirror of bronze and hurled it across the chamber. It fell with a loud crash against the delicate mosaic of the floor, but as it swung through the air its sharp metal edge hit a young slave girl on the shoulder. A few drops of blood trickled down her breast, and she began to whimper in her fright. It had all happened so suddenly that no one, least of all Licinia, could guess what it was that had so angered my lady. Dea Flavia had raised herself to a sitting posture, and thrown her hair back, away from her face, which looked flushed and wrathful, whilst two sharp furrows appeared between her brows. The women were silent, feeling awed and not a little frightened. The girl, whose shoulder was now bleeding profusely, continued her whimpering. "Get up, girl," said Licinia roughly, "and staunch thy scratch elsewhere, away from my lady's sight. Hark at the baggage! One would think she is really hurt. Get thee gone, I say, ere I give thee better cause for whining." But in a moment Dea Flavia was on her feet. With a quick cry of pity she ran to her slave, kneeled beside her, and with a fine white cloth herself tried to staunch the wound. "Art hurt?" she said gently. "Art hurt, child? I did not wish to hurt thee. Stop thy weeping, and I'll give thee that amber locket which thou dost covet so. Stop thy weeping, I say. It is my white rabbit thou dost hanker after. Thou shalt have it for thine own. Or the woollen tunic with the embroidered bands. Or stop whining, girl," she added impatiently, seeing that the girl, more frightened than hurt, was sobbing louder than before. "Licinia, make her stop. She angers me with all this whining. Stop, I tell thee. Oh, Licinia, where is thy whip? I vow I'll have the girl whipped if she does not stop." But Licinia, accustomed to her mistress' quick changing moods, had in her turn knelt beside the girl, and was busy now with deft hands in staunching the blood and tying up the wound. This done she dragged the child up roughly, though not unkindly, from the ground. "Get thee gone and lie down on thy bed," she said. "Shame on thee for making such a to do. My lady hath no wish to hurt thee, and thou hast upset her with all this senseless weeping. Get thee gone now ere I do give thee that whipping which thou dost well deserve." She contrived to push the girl out of the chamber, and ordered two others to follow and look after her. Then once more she turned to her mistress, ready to tender fond apologies since what she had said had so angered her beloved. Dea Flavia had thrown herself on the couch on her back. Her arms were folded behind her head. Her fair hair lay in heavy masses on the embroidered coverlet. She was staring straight up at the ceiling, her blue eyes wide open, and a puzzled frown across her brow. "My precious one," murmured Licinia. But Dea Flavia apparently did not hear. It seemed as if she were grappling in her mind with some worrying puzzle, the solution of which lay hidden up there behind that brilliant bit of blue sky which glimmered through the square opening in the roof. "My precious one," reiterated the old woman appealingly, "tell me, Dea, was it aught that I said which angered thee?" Dea Flavia turned large wondering eyes to her old nurse. "Licinia," she said slowly. "Yes, my goddess. If a man saith that there is one greater, mightier than Cæsar, he is a traitor, is he not?" "A black and villainous traitor, Augusta," said Licinia, whose voice at the mere suggestion had become hoarse with awe. "And what in Rome is the punishment for such traitors, Licinia?" asked the young girl, still speaking slowly and measuredly. "Death, my child," replied the old woman. "Only death?" insisted Dea, whilst the puzzled look in her eyes became more marked and the frown between her brows more deep. "I do not understand thee, my precious one," said Licinia, whose turn it was now to be deeply puzzled. "What greater punishment could there be for a traitor than that of death? They torture slaves for lesser offences than that. Aye, and for sedition there is always the cross." "The cross?" she murmured. "Yes. Dost remember 7 years ago in Judæa there was a man who raised sedition among the Jews and called himself their king, settling himself above Cæsar and above the might of Cæsar. They crucified him. Dost remember?" "I have heard of him," she said curtly. "What was his name?" "Nay, I have forgot. Methinks that he came from Galilee. They did crucify him because of sedition, and because he set himself to be above Cæsar." "And above the house of Cæsar?" "Aye, above the house of Cæsar too." "And they crucified him?" "Aye, like a common thief. 'Twas right and just, since he rebelled against Cæsar. And yet, Licinia, there are those in Rome who do him service even now." "The gods forbid!" exclaimed Licinia in horror. "And how could that be?" she added, with a shrug of the shoulders, "seeing that he died such a shameful death?" "I marvel on that also," said the young girl, whose wide open blue eyes once more assumed their strangely puzzled expression. "Nay, I'll not believe it," rejoined the old woman hotly. "Do that man service, a common traitor who died upon the cross? Who did stuff thine ears, my goddess, with such foolish tales?" "No one told me foolish tales, Licinia. But this I do know, that there are some in Rome who set that Galilean above the majesty of Cæsar, and in his name do defy Cæsar's might." "They are madmen then," said the slave curtly. "Or traitors," added Dea Flavia. "Thou sayest it. They are traitors and rebels, and never fear, they'll be punished. Sooner or later, they will be punished. Defy the might of Cæsar! Great gods above! The impious wretches! Thou wert right, my princess. Death alone were too merciful for them. The scourge first, and then the cross. That will teach them the might of thy house, O daughter of Cæsar. I would have no mercy with them. Throw them to the beasts, say I. Brand them, scorch them, wring their hearts' blood until they cry for death." The old pagan looked evil and cruel in her fury of loyalty to that house which begat her beloved Dea. Her eyes glistened as those of a cat waiting to fall upon its prey. Her wrinkled hands looked like claws that were ready to tear the very flesh and sinew from the traitor's breast. Her voice, always hoarse and trembling, had risen to a savage shriek which died away as in a passionate outburst of love she threw herself down on the floor beside the couch, and taking Dea's tiny feet between her hands, she covered them with kisses and with tears. But Dea Flavia once more lay back on the coverlet of crimson silk, and her blue eyes once more were fixed upward to the sky. Above her the glint of blue was now suffused with tones of pink merging into mauve. Somewhere out west the sun was slowly sinking into rest. Tiny golden clouds flitted swiftly across that patch of sky on which Dea Flavia gazed so intently. "Come, kiss me, Licinia," she said slowly after a while. "I'll to rest now. To-morrow I shall see my kinsman, the Cæsar, again, after a year's absence from him. I desire to be very beautiful to-morrow, Licinia, for mayhap I'll to the games with him. The new tunic worked with purple and gold. I'll wear that and my new shoes of antelope skin. In my hair the circlet of turquoise and pearls. Dost think it'll become me, Licinia? Thou wilt be more beautiful, my precious one, than men's eyes can conveniently endure," said Licinia, whose whole face became radiant with the joy of her perfect love for the girl. "Ah, thou hast soothed my heart and mind, Licinia. I feel that I shall sleep well to night." She allowed the old woman to lead her gently to her bedchamber, where within the narrow alcove she lay all that night, tossing upon the silken mattress that was stuffed with eiderdown. Sleep would not come to her, and hour after hour she lay there, her eyes fixed into the darkness on which at times her fervid fancy traced a glowing cross. Chapter 7.
Chapter 8 of Unto Caesar. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrea. Unto Caesar. Chapter 8. The lot is cast into the lap, but the whole disposing thereof is of the Lord. Proverbs 16:33. And even thus did the mighty empire hurry headlong to its fall, with shouts of joy and cries of exultation, with triumphal processions, with music, with games, and with flowers. The Cæsar had returned from Germany, and Gaul, having played his part of mountebank upon the arena of the world, eaten up with senseless and cynical vanity, Caius Julius Cæsar Caligula desired to be the Cæsar of his army, as he was princeps and imperator, high pontiff and supreme dictator of the empire. But as there was no war to conduct, no rebellion to subdue, he had invented a war and harassed some barbarians who had no thought save that of peace. He stage managed conspiracies and midnight attacks, drilling his own soldiers into acting the parts of malcontents, of escaped prisoners, of bloodthirsty barbarians, while he himself, as chief actor in the play, vanquished the mock foes and took from them mock spoils of war. Then he upbraided Rome for her inertia, whilst he, the Emperor, confronted dangers and endured hardships for her sake. His letters, full of glowing accounts of his supposed prowess, of the ferocity of the enemy, of the fruits of victory snatched at the cost of innumerable sacrifices, were solemnly read to the assembled senators in the Temple of Mars, and to a vast concourse of people gathered in the Forum. They listened to these letters with awe and reverence, proud of the valour of their Cæsar, rejoicing in the continued glory of the mightiest empire of the world, their own empire, which they, the masters of the earth and of the sea, had made under the guidance of rulers such as he who even now was returning laurel laden and victory crowned from Germany. And the triumphal procession was begun. First came the galley in which Caligula was said to have crossed the ocean for the purpose of subduing some rebel British princes, but in which he in verity had spent some pleasant days fishing in a bay. It was brought back to Rome in the solemn state by land, right across the country of the Alemanni, and carried the whole of the way by 16 stalwart barbarians, supposed prisoners of war. The galley was received with imperial honours, as if it had been a human creature, the very person of the Cæsar. In the presence of a huge and enthusiastic crowd it was taken to the temple of Mars, when the pontiffs, attired in their festal robes, dedicated it with solemn ritual to the god of war, and finally deposited it in a specially constructed cradle fashioned of citrus wood, with elaborate carvings and touches of gilding thereon, the whole resting upon a pedestal of African marble. Upon the next day a procession of Gauls entered the city carrying helmets which were filled with sea shells. The men wore their hair long and unkempt. They were naked save for a goatskin tied across the torso with a hempen rope, and their shins were encircled with leather bands. The helmets were said to have belonged to those of Cæsar's soldiers who had lost their lives in an expedition against the Germans, and the sea shells were a special tribute from the ocean to the gods of the capital. By Cæsar's orders the helmets were to be the objects of semi-divine honours in the memory of the illustrious dead. Thus the tragi-comedy went on day after day, the plebes enjoying the pageants because they did not know that they were being fooled, the patricians looking on because they did not care. And now the imperial mountebank was coming home himself, having ordered his triumph as he had stage managed his deeds of valour. Triumphal arches and street decorations, flowers and processions, he had ordained everything just as he wished it to be, from the statue of every god in the temples of the capital and of the Forum. The bronze head had been knocked off by his orders, and a likeness of his own head placed in substitution. His intention was to receive divine homage, and this the plebs, who had been promised a succession of holidays, with races, games, and combats, was over ready to grant him. The vestibule connecting his palace with the temple of Castor had been completed in his absence, and he wished to pass surreptitiously from his own apartments to the very niche of the idol which was in full view of the Forum, and there to show himself to the people, even whilst a sacrifice was offered to him as to a god. To all this senseless display of egregious vanity, the obsequiousness of the senators and the careless frivolity of the plebs easily lent itself, nor did anyone demur at the decree which came from the absent hero that he should in the future be styled the father of the armies, the greatest and best of Cæsars. All thought of dignity was dead in these descendants of the great people who had made the empire. They had long ago sold their birthright of valour and of honour for the pottage of luxury and the favours of a tyrannical madman. What cared they if after they had feasted and shouted themselves hoarse in praise of a deified brute, the ruins of Rome came crashing down over their graves? What cared they if in far-off barbaric lands the Goths and Huns were already whetting their steel? Only a few among the more dignified senators, a few among the more sober praetorian tribunes, revolted in their heart at this insane exhibition of egoism, these perpetual outrages on common sense and dignity. But they were few and the influence small, and they were really too indolent, too comfortable in their luxurious homes to do aught but accept what they had deemed inevitable. The only men in Rome who cared were the ambitious and the self-seekers, and they cared not because of Rome, not because of the glory of the empire, or the welfare of the land, but because they saw in the very excess of the tyrant's misrule the best chance for their own supremacy and power. Foremost among these was Caius Nepos, the praetorian praefect, all powerful in the absence of the Cæsar, well liked by the army, so 'twas said. Some influential friends clung around him, and also some malcontents, those who are ever on the spot when destruction is to be accomplished, ever ready to overthrow any government which does not happen to further their ambitions. Most of these men were assembled this night beneath the gilded roof of Caius Nepos' house. He had gathered all his friends round him, had feasted them with good viands and costly wines, with roasted peacocks from Gaul and mullets come straight from the sea. He had amused them with oriental dancers and Egyptian acrobats, and when they had eaten and drunk their fill, he bade them good night and sent them home laden with gifts. But his intimates remained behind, pretending to leave with the others. They lingered on in the atrium, chatting of indifferent topics amongst themselves, until all had gone whose presence would not be wanted in the conclave that was to take place. There were now some 40 of them in number, rich patricians all of them, their ages ranging from that of young Aeschines, who was just 20 years old, to that of Marcus Ancreus, the elder, who had turned 60. Their combined wealth mayhap would have purchased every inhabited house in the entire civilized world, or every slave who was ever put up in the market. Marcus Ancreus, they say, could have pulled down every temple in the Forum and rebuilt it at his own cost, and Philippus Decius, who was there, had recently spent the sum of 50 million sesterces upon the building and equipment of his new villa at Herculaneum. Young Hortensius Martius was there too, he who was said to own more slaves than anyone else in Rome, and Augustus Philario of the household of Caesar, who had once declared that he would give 100,000 aurei for a secret poison that would defy detection. "Why is not Taurus Antinor here this evening?" asked Marcus Ancreus, when this little group of privileged guests once more turned back toward the triclinium. "I think that he will be here anon," replied the host. "I have sent him word that I desired speech with him on business of the state, and that I craved the honour of his company." They all assembled at the head of the now deserted tables. The few slaves who had remained at the bidding of their master had redraped the couches and reset the crystal goblets of wine and the gold dishes with fresh fruit. The long narrow hall looked strangely mournful now that the noisy guests had departed, and the sweet scented oil in the lamps had begun to burn low. The table, laden with empty jars, with broken goblets, and remnants of fruits and cakes, looked uninviting and even weird in its aspect of departed cheer. The couches beneath their tumbled draperies of richly dyed silk looked bedraggled and forlorn, whilst the stains of wine upon the fine white cloths looked like widening streams of blood. Under the shadows of elaborate carvings in the marble of the walls, ghost-like shadows flickered and danced as the smoke from the oil lamp wound its spiral curves upwards towards the gilded ceiling above. And in the great vases of priceless myrrh roses and lilies and white tuberoses, the spoils of costly glass houses were slowly drooping in the heavy atmosphere. The whole room, despite its rich hangings and gilded pillars, wore a curious air of desolation and of gloom. Mayhap Caius Nepos himself was conscious of this, for as he followed his guests from out the atrium he gave 3 loud claps with his hands, and a troop of young girls came in carrying bunches of fresh flowers and some newly filled lamps. These they placed at the head of the table, there where the couches surrounding it were draped with crimson silk, and soft downy cushions, well shaken up, once more called to rest and good cheer. "I pray you all take your places," said the host pleasantly, "and let us resume our supper." He gave a sign to a swarthy looking slave who, clad all in white, was presiding at a gorgeous buffet carved of solid citrus wood, which, despite the fact that supper had just been served to 200 guests, was once more groaning under the weight of mammoth dishes filled with the most complicated products of culinary art. The slave, at his master's sign, touched a silver gong, and half a dozen henchmen in linen tunics brought in the steaming dishes fresh from the kitchens. The carver set to and attacked with long sharp knife the gigantic capons which one of the bearers had placed before him. He carved with quickness and dexterity, placing well chosen morsels on the plates of massive gold which young waiting maids then carried to the guests. "Wilt dismiss thy slaves before we talk?" asked Marcus Ancreus, the veteran in this small crowd. He himself had been silent for the past 10 minutes, doing full justice to the second relay of Caius Nepos' hospitality. The waiting maids were going round now, with gilt basins and cloths of fine white linen for the cleansing and drying of fingers between the courses. Others, in the meanwhile, filled the crystal goblets with red or white wine as the guests desired. "We can talk now," said the host. "These slaves will not heed us. They," he added, nodding in the direction of the carver and his half-dozen henchmen, "are all deaf as well as mute, so we need have no fear of them." "What treasures!" ejaculated young Aeschines, with wondering eyes fixed upon his lucky host. "Where didst thou get them, Caius Nepos? By the gods, I would I could get an army of deaf-mute slaves." "They are not easy to get," rejoined the other, "but I was mightily lucky in my find. I was at Cirta, in Numidia, at the time when the dusky chief there, one named Hazim Ran, had made a haul of 6 malcontents who I understood had conspired against his authority. It seems that these rebels had a leader who had succeeded in escaping to his desert fastness, and whom Hazim Ran greatly desired to capture. To gain this object he commanded the 6 prisoners to betray their leader. This they refused to do, whereupon the dusky prince ordered their ears to be cut off, and threatened them that unless they spoke on the morrow, their tongues would be cut off the next day, and if after that they still remained obdurate, their heads would go the way of their tongues and ears." Exclamations of horror greeted this gruesome tale, the relevancy of which no one had as yet perceived. But Caius Nepos, having pledged his friends in a draught of Sicilian wine, resumed: "I, as an idle traveller from Rome, had been received by the dusky chieftain with marked deference, and I was greatly interested in the fate of the 6 men who proved so loyal to their leader. So I waited 3 days, and when their tongues and ears had been cut off and their heads were finally threatened, I offered to buy them for a sum sufficiently large to tempt the cupidity of Hazim Ran. And thus I had in my possession 6 men whose sense of loyalty had been splendidly proved, and whose discretion henceforth would necessarily be absolute." This time a chorus of praise greeted the conclusion of the tale. The cynical calm with which it had been told, and the ferocious selfishness which it revealed, seemed in no way repellent to Caius Nepos' guests. A few pairs of indifferent eyes were levelled at the slaves, and that was all. And then Philippus Decius remarked coolly: "So much for thy carvers and henchmen, O Caius Nepos. But thy waiting maids, are they deaf and dumb too?" "No," replied the host, "but they come from foreign lands and do not understand our tongue." "Then you all think that the next few days will be propitious for our schemes?" here broke in young Escanes, who seemed the most eager amongst them all. "Aye," said Caius Nepos, "with a little good luck even to-morrow night might prove the best day. The Cæsar is half frenzied now, gorged with his triumph, the mockery of which he does not seem to understand. He is more like a raving madman than ever, much more feeble in mind and body than before this insensate expedition to Germany." "I suppose that there is no doubt as to the truth of the tales which are current about the expedition?" quoth Marcus Ancyrus, whose years rendered him more cautious than the others. "No doubt whatever," rejoined the host, "and some of the tales fall far short of the truth. There never was a real blow struck during the whole time that madman was away. He travelled from place to place in his litter, borne by 8 men, and sent his soldiers ahead of him with sprays and buckets of water, that they should lay the dust along the road on which he would travel. At Trevor on the banks of the Rhine, he caused 200 of his picked guard to dress up as barbarians and to make feint to attack the camp at midnight. This they did with necessary shoutings and clashings of steel against steel. Then did the greatest and best of Cæsars sally forth in full battle array, followed by a few of his most trusted men, and in the darkness there was heard more shouting and more clashings of steel, until Caligula returned in triumph at sunrise to his camp. He had passed hempen ropes round the necks of the mock barbarians, and ever after had them dragged in the wake of his litter, even as if they were prisoners of war. No doubt he had paid them well for acting such a farce. But was the army blind to all this folly? The Cæsar only kept some 500 picked men round him in his camp. These he bribed into acquiescence of all his mad pranks. The rest of the legions were some distance away all the time. They believed all that they were told. Mayhap they thought it wisest to believe. "I know that in Belgica, on the shores of the ocean," began Augustus Philario after a while, but he was not allowed to proceed. Shouts of derision broke in upon the tale, followed by expressions of rage. "What is the good of retailing further follies?" said Caius Nepos at last. "We all know that a madman, a vain, besotted fool, wields now the sceptre of Julius Cæsar and of great Augustus. The numbers of his misdeeds are like the grains of sand on the seashore. His orgies have shamed our generation, his debauches are a disgrace upon the fame of Rome. Patricians, awake! The day hath come, the hour is close at hand. To-morrow, mayhap, at the public games, a tumult amongst the people. It should be easy to rouse that. Then a well-edged dagger, and the Empire is rid of the most hideous and loathsome tyrant that ever brutalised a nation and shamed an empire." Even as he spoke, and despite the deaf-mute slaves and the foreign girls, he lowered his voice until it sank to the merest whisper. Reclining upon the couches, with elbows buried in silken cushions, the others all stretched forward now, until 20 of heads met in one continued circle, forehead to forehead, and ear to ear, whilst in the midst of them an oil lamp flickered low and lit up at fitful intervals the sober, callous faces, with the hard mouths and cruel, steely eyes. The slaves, those who had lost ears and tongue, and those who spoke no language save their own foreign one, had retreated to the far corners of the room, up against the columns of Phrygian marble or the hangings of Tyrian tapestries. Their great uncomprehending eyes were fixed on that compact group at the head of the table, where round the bowls of roses and of lilies and the goblets of wine, the future of the Empire of Rome was even now being discussed. "The tumult can be easily provoked," said one of the guests presently, a young man whose black hair and dark eyes bespoke his Oriental blood. "The Cæsar is certain to provoke it himself by some insane act of tyrannical folly. You must all remember how, 2 years ago, during the Megalesian games, he ordered the women of his retinue to descend into the arena and to engage the gladiators in combat. At this outrage the discontent among the people nearly broke out into open revolt. It was thou, Caius Nepos, who checked the tumult then." "The hour was not ripe," said the latter, "and we were not allied. It will be different to morrow." "How will it be to morrow?" "When the tumult is at its highest, he who has the surest hand shall strike the Cæsar down, I in the meanwhile." "Then thou, Caius Nepos, art not certain of the sureness of thy hand?" interposed Hortensius Martius, who hitherto had taken no active part in the discussion. He lay on a couch at some distance from his host, and had declined every morsel offered to him by the waiting maids, but he had drunk over freely, and his good-looking young face looked flushed and dark beneath its wealth of curls. Unlike his usual self, he was ill-humoured and almost morose to-night, and there was a dark, glowering look in his eyes as from time to time he cast furtive glances towards the door. "Nay, good Hortensius," said the host loftily, "mine will be the greater part. The praetorian guard know and trust me. It will be my duty when the Cæsar is attacked to keep them from rushing to his aid. The army is apt to forget a tyrant's crime, and to think of him only as a leader to be obeyed. But when the guard hear my voice, they will understand and will be true to me." "'Tis I will strike," now broke in young Escanes with all the enthusiasm of his years. The ardour of leadership glowed upon his face, and he seemed to challenge this small assembly to dispute his right to the foremost place in the great event of the morrow. But his challenge was not taken up. No one else seemed eager to dispute his wish. Somewhat sobered, he resumed more calmly: "The Cæsar hath much affection for me. I oft sat beside him in the circus or at the games last year. The Augustus too like to have me beside them, to talk pleasing gossip in their ears. 'Twill be easiest for me, at a signal given, to strike with my dagger in the Cæsar's throat." "Thine shall be that glory, O Escanes, since thou dost will it so," said Caius Nepos, not without a touch of irony. "Directly the deed is done, the praetorian guard shall raise the cry, 'The Cæsar is dead.'" "And it should be at once followed by another," said Marcus Ancyrus the elder, "by 'Hail to thee, O mighty Cæsar!'" "'Tis thou should raise that cry, O Caius Nepos," said Hortensius with a sarcastic curl of his lip. "Oh, as to that," began the other with some hesitation. "Aye, as to that," said Escanes hotly. "If I slay the tyrant to morrow with mine own hand, then I must know at least for whom I do the deed." There was silence after that. Everyone seemed absorbed in his own thoughts. Dreamy eyes gazed abstractedly in the crystal goblets, as if vainly trying to trace in its crimson depths the outline of an imperial sceptre. At last Caius Nepos spoke: "Let us be rid of the tyrant first. The army will soon elect its new chief." "And is it on the support of the army, O praefect, that thou dost base thine own hopes of supreme power?" asked Hortensius, whose ill humour seemed to grow on him more and more. "Nay," retorted Caius Nepos, "I did not know that by so doing I was dashing thine." "Silence!" admonished Marcus Ancyrus the elder. "Are we children or slaves that we should wrangle thus? Have we met here in order to rid the empire of an abominable and bloodthirsty tyrant, or are we mere vulgar conspirators pursuing our own ends? There was no thought in our host's mind of supreme power, O Hortensius, nor in thine, I'll vow. As for me, I care naught for the Imperium," he added naively. "It is difficult to content every one, and a permanent consulship under our chosen Cæsar were more to my liking. Bring forth thy tablets, O Caius Nepos, and we'll put the matter to the vote. There are not many of the house of Cæsar fit to succeed the present madman, and our choice there will be limited." "There is but Claudius, the brother of Germanicus," interposed the host curtly. "Germanicus's brother to succeed Germanicus's son," said another with a contemptuous shrug of the shoulders. "And he is as crazy as his nephew," added Caius Nepos. He had not assembled his friends here to night. He had not feasted them and loaded them with gifts with a view to passing the Imperium merely from one head to another. He was fairly sure of the support of the praetorian guard, whose praefect he was, and had counted on the adherence of these malcontents, who he hoped would look to him for future favours, whilst raising him to supreme dignity. He liked not this talk of the family of Cæsar, which took the attention of his closest adherents away from his own claim. "The entire house of Cæsar," he said, "is rotten to the core. There is not one member of it fit to rule." "But of a truth," said prudent Ancyrus, "they have the foremost claim." "Then if that be the case," broke in young Hortensius Martius suddenly, "let us turn to the one member of the house of Cæsar who is noble and pure, exalted above all." "There is none such," said Caius Nepos hotly. "Aye, there is one," retorted the younger man. "His name?" came loudly from every side. "I spoke of a woman." "A woman!" and shouts of derisive laughter broke from every lip. Only Marcus Ancyrus remained grave and thoughtful, and now he said: "Dost perchance speak of Dea Flavia Augusta?" "Even of her," replied Hortensius. Involuntarily at the name the voice of the older man had assumed a respectful tone, and all around the vulgar sneers and bitter mockery had died away as if by magic contact with something hallowed and pure. Even Caius Nepos thought it wise to subdue his tone of contempt, and merely said curtly: "A goddess of truth, but a woman cannot lead an army or rule an empire." "No," rejoined Hortensius Martius, "but a wise and virtuous woman can rule wisely and virtuously over the man whom she will choose for mate." There was silence for a moment or two, whilst young Hortensius's glowing eyes swept questioningly over the assembly. Every one there knew of his passion for the Augusta, a passion, in truth, shared by many of those who had the privilege of knowing her intimately, and strangely enough, though the proposal had so much daring in it, it met with but little opposition. "Wouldst thou then suggest, O Hortensius Martius," quoth Marcus Ancyrus, the elder, after a slight pause, "that the Augusta's husband be made Emperor of Rome?" "Why not?" retorted the other simply. "It is not a bad notion," mused young Escanes, who thought himself high in the favour of Dea Flavia. "An admirable one," assented Ancyrus, "for we must remember that Dea Flavia Augusta is of the true blood of the Cæsars, the blood of the great Augustus, and there is none better. Since she, as a woman, cannot rule men or lead an army, what more fitting than that her lord, whoever he might be, should receive the Imperium through her hands?" "He might prove to be a more miserable creature than the Caligula himself," suggested Philario, who was too ill favoured to have the hopes of winning the proud and imperious beauty for himself. "Nay, that were impossible," asserted Hortensius hotly. "The man whom Dea Flavia will favour will be a brave man, else he would not dare to woo her. He will be honourable and noble, else he could never win her." "Methinks that thou art right, O Hortensius," added Ancyrus, who had taken upon himself the role of a wise and prudent counsellor, "and moreover he will be rich by virtue of the wealth which the Augusta will have as a marriage portion. Her money, merged with the state funds, would be of vast benefit to the land." "And on his death and his sons and hers, a direct descendant of great Augustus would be the only fitting heir," concluded another. "Meseems now," said Ancyrus decisively, "that we would solve a grave difficulty by accepting the suggestion made by Hortensius Martius. The Imperium, as is only just, would remain in the family of the great Augustus. We should have a brave, noble and rich Cæsar, whose virtuous and beautiful wife would wield beneficial influence over him, and for the present we should all be working for unselfish ends. Not one of us here present can say for a certainty whom the Augusta will choose for mate. Directly the tyrant is swept out of the way, we, who have brought about the great end, will ask her to make her choice. Thus our aims will have been pure and selfless. Each one of us here will have risked all for the sake of the unknown. What say you, friends? Shall we pledge our loyalty to the man whom not one of us here can name this day, a man mayhap still unknown to us, the future lord of Dea Flavia Augusta, of the house of Caesar? The peroration seemed greatly to the liking of the assembled company. The thought that they would all be working with pure and selfless motives flattered these men egregious vanity. Vaguely every one of them hoped that all the others would believe in his unselfish aims, even whilst every one meant to work solely for his own ends. Hortensius Martius's proposal pleased because it opened out such magnificent possibilities. The Imperium itself, which had seemed infinitely remote from so many, now appeared within reach of all. Anyone who was young, well favoured, and of patrician birth might aspire to the hand of the Augusta, and not one of those who possessed at least two of those qualifications doubted his own ability to win. Raising himself to a more upright position, Marcus Ancyrus the elder, goblet in hand, looked round for approval on all the guests. The murmur of acquiescence was well nigh general, and many there were who held their goblets to the waiting maids in order to have them filled and then drain them to the last dregs. But there were a few dissentient voices, chiefly among the less favoured who, like Philario, could hardly dare approach a beautiful woman with thoughts of wooing her. Caius Nepos had not taken up the pledge, nor had he taken any part in the discussion since Dea Flavia's name first passed the lips of young Hortensius. Indeed, as the latter seemed to lose his ill humour and become flushed and excited with the approval of his friends, so did the host gradually become more and more morose and silent. Clearly the proposal to leave the matter of the choice of a Cæsar in the hands of a woman was not to his liking. Though good-looking and still in the prime of life, he had never found favour with women, and Dea Flavia had often shown open contempt for him, and for the selfish ambition which moved his every action, and which he was at no pains to conceal. It was easy to see by the glowering look on his face that the meeting this night had not turned out as he had wished. "We cannot decide this matter otherwise than by vote," said one of the guests when the murmurs of approval and those of dissent had equally died down. "Thou art right, O friend," assented Ancyrus, "and I pray thee, Caius Nepos, order thy slaves to bring us the tablets, and let each man record his vote according to his will." Caius Nepos could find no objection to this, even though the question of voting was in no way to his liking. He had a vague hope, mayhap, that by gaining time he might succeed in sowing seeds of discord amongst those who had been so ready to accede to the new proposal. Any moment, even now, a chance word spoken, a trifling incident, an incipient quarrel might sway these men and bring them back to their allegiance to himself. He had been so sure of their support. The banquet this night had been destined to set the seal to their fealty and to cement their friendship. It was more than exasperating that the suggestion of a young fool should have caused them to swerve from their promised adherence. For the moment, however, he could not help but acquiesce outwardly in the wish of the majority. After an imperceptible moment of hesitation, he called to one of his deaf-mute slaves, and made him understand by signs that he wanted 40 wax tablets prepared and brought hither, with 40 stylets wherewith to write. Then he cheerily bade his guests once more to eat and drink and to make merry. And it was characteristic of these strange products of a decadent age, that in the midst of grave discussions wherein their own lives and the future aggrandisement were at stake, these men were quite ready to respond to their host's invitation, and momentarily to forget their own ambitious schemes in the enjoyment of Epicurean delights. Wine and fruit were once more handed round. Both were excellent, and during a brief interval mighty issues were set aside, and conversation became more general and more free. The pageant of games and combats, which was to last for over 30 days in honour of the deification of Caligula and his safe return from Germany, became the subject of eager talk. There had been rumours of a remarkable load of African lions arrived in the Tiber a day or two ago, which were to make a gorgeous spectacle in the arena pitted against some tigers from Numidia. There was also talk of a novelty in the shape of crocodiles who were said to fight with great cunning and power against a pack of hyenas from the desert. Then there would be the chariot races and gladiatorial combats. Heavy betting on these events had been in progress for some time all over the city amongst the wealthy patricians as well as among the impoverished plebs. The respective merits of the blues, the greens, the reds and the yellows were the subject of heated discussions, and Caius Nepos was glad to note that more than a suspicion of antagonism was aroused between his guests in the defence of their respective choice. He only took a very cursory part in the discussion, putting in a word here and there where contradiction or approval might further inflame overheated tempers, and he ordered his slaves to pour the wine with a free hand, and himself was ready to pledge every one of his guests over and over again for as long as they were ready to drink. Inside the room the heat had become excessive, the evening air only entered through narrow windows, and the gentle breeze did no more than fan the flames of the oil lamps, or make the petals of dying roses tremble and fall. The noise grew louder and louder as the fumes of heady wines obscured the brains of these makers of future empires. Slaves were called for loudly to undo the tunics and to help cast off all but the necessary garments. Every face round the table now was flushed and moist, every forehead streaming with perspiration. Escanes, goblet in hand, was singing a ribald song, the chorus of which was taken up by the group of young men nearest to him. The older ones were making insane bets and driving preposterous bargains over horses and slaves. By the time that the slaves had returned with the tablets, the praetorian praefect had cause to be satisfied with the temper of his guests. Coarse jests and drunken oaths were heard more often than whispered serious talk. The names of popular gladiators seemed of more account than those of future Cæsars. Curls were dishevelled and laurel crowns awry. The silken draperies on the couches had become tattered rags, and the cushions were scattered all about the floor. Debris of crystal vases littered the table, and bunches of dying flowers were tossed about by unsteady hands. Given a little more time, a few more draughts of Sicilian wine, and all thoughts of voting for a future Cæsar would be beyond the mental power of these degenerates, and drunken quarrels would turn to violent enmity. This Caius Nepos had in mind when he took the tablets from the slaves, and threw them down with affected carelessness on the table before him. "We cannot vote," he said loudly, "whilst Taurus Antinor is not here." His words were even more potent than he had hoped. All that he had wanted was further delay, and most of his guests nodded approval with drunken solemnity, and then called for more wine. But Hortensius Martius, who, though he had drunk as heavily as others, had not joined in the ribald songs or the senseless orgy of shouts and of laughter, now jumped up with a violent oath. "What hath Taurus Antinor to do with us?" he shouted at the top of his voice, "or we with Taurus Antinor? You do not intend, I trust, to raise a freed man to the imperium and place the sceptre of Cæsar in the hands of a descendant of slaves." He was trembling with such unbridled fury, his eyes glowed with the lust of such deadly hate, that instinctively the ribald songs and immoderate laughter were hushed, and eyes, veiled with the film of intoxication, were turned wonderingly upon him. But Caius Nepos was smiling blandly. The ire of Hortensius pleased him even though he did not understand its cause. "Nay, as to that," he said, "are we not all descended from slaves? Taurus Antinor hath the ear of the plebs. Doth suggest, O Hortensius, that he also hath the ear of Dea Flavia Augusta?" He had shot this arrow into the air, little guessing how hard and truly it would hit. Hortensius was making vigorous efforts to curb his temper, biting his lips until tiny drops of blood slowly trickled down his chin, but he felt that the mocking eyes of his host were upon him, and had just a sufficiency of reason left in him to see through the machinations of Caius Nepos. He would not hold himself up to ridicule now before those who should prove his strong supporters in the future. His proposal had not yet been put to the vote, and he did not mean to alienate his adherents by an insane show of maniacal rage. "Of that," he said in response to his host's taunt, in a voice quivering with the mighty effort of control, "of that there is but little fear. The Augusta is too proud to look with favour on a stranger. As for me, I would sooner ask Escanes to plunge his dagger in my throat than I would serve the Empire under the Cæsarship of Taurus Antinor." "Thou canst record thy vote as thou thinkest best," said Caius Nepos with calm urbanity, and those who were sufficiently sober nodded approval with solemn gravity. "Nay," here interposed Marcus Ancyrus with stern reproof, "before we begin to vote, let us be agreed on one point. Let us be prepared to swear by the gods that we will adhere truly and loyally to the choice of the majority, and if, as meseems is likely, We agree that the unknown future husband of Dea Flavia Augusta become the ruler of us all. Then we must swear to proclaim him the Cæsar with one accord. Else doth our voting become a mere farce. Friends, before ye vote, are you ready to take this oath?" "Aye, aye," came from almost every mouth round the table, but they nodded like automatons, with heavy heads that rolled on bowed shoulders and blurred eyes half hidden behind closing lids. "I'll not swear allegiance to Taurus Antinor," persisted Hortensius obstinately. "Dost think it likely that Augusta favours him?" asked the host ironically. "No, but then what hast thou to fear?" "As for me," interposed young Escanes in a thick voice broken by hiccoughs, "I am ready to swear as Marcus Ancyrus directs. If we are not satisfied with the new Cæsar, whoever he may be, my dagger will not rust in the meanwhile. I can easily whet it again." Even as these last cynical words left the young man's lips, there came from outside a noise of much shouting and shuffling of naked feet, and anon the sound of a voice, loud and harsh, asking for leave to speak with the praetorian praefect. Caius Nepos paused, tablets in hand. Strangely enough the voice, though well known, seemed to have a sobering effect on all these ebullient tempers. Marcus Ancyrus, who was the most calm among them all, threw a quick glance of inquiry on his host. One or two furtive glances were exchanged. A look that was half ashamed crept into some of the faces, and there were hurried, whispered calls to the slaves to bring the bags of ice. Quickly the tunics were readjusted and an attempt made at re-establishing some semblance of decorum round the table. Caius Nepos was giving hastily whispered directions to the waiting maids. "Pull that coverlet straight, quick," he ordered, "and those cushions. Pick them off the ground. That broken vase. Set it aside. There. Try and hide that wine stain with a fresh cloth." And all the while rapid, eager questions flew from mouth to mouth. "Wilt tell him at once, O Caius Nepos?" Or, "Wilt ply him with wine first? 'Twere safer." "Nay, nay," said Escanes, whose wrists and ankles were being bathed. "That would take too long. Taurus Antinor hath a strong head, and I for one could not keep sober another half hour." "Dost know if he is one with us?" was the query that came from every side. Hortensius Martius alone had remained silent. He did not call either for water or for ice. It was his hatred that had sobered him, making the lines of his face set and hard, causing the flush to die from his cheeks and leaving them ashy pale. "Dost know if he is at one with us?" reiterated Augustus Philario impatiently. He had ordered a slave to hold lumps of ice to his forehead, whilst Philippus Decius, lying next to him, was having perfume rubbed into the back of his neck. "We must look stern and deliberate," said Ancyrus. "Dost know, O Caius Nepos, if he is at one with us?" "We must enlist him," rejoined the latter hurriedly. "He holds the plebs, and without his help opposition might become difficult. A word from him to the crowd, and the new Cæsar is assured of peace within the city." "Then do thou tell him what has been decided," said one of the others, who was busy smoothing his tangled hair. "No, no," whispered cautious Ancyrus the elder. "Have a care! Thou, Caius Nepos, must probe him ere thou speakest." "Tell him naught of Escanes' dagger," added another hurriedly. "Speak of abdication," said the older man, "of anything that comes in thy mind. Some men there are who—" But he had no time to explain his meaning further, for the next moment Taurus Antinor stepped into the room. End of chapter 8.